So before we go into an idea of how to creatively discuss the laws of Pesach, we can hardly do that if we're not aware of the fundamentals, and it's anyway crucial every year, I do it myself, to review what needs to be done on Pesach. And there are just so many commandments. So before we go to that, when is Pesach? So this year, it begins next Friday, April 19th at around sunset, which is roughly 7:30. And it ends Saturday night the following week, shortly before 9. So Friday night the 19th until Saturday night the 27th. In the diaspora, in Israel, it will be one day shorter. And there's just so many things happening. We have, first of all, a negative commandment, so to speak, a prohibition, to eat chametz. Chametz is any of 5 grains. One is wheat, one is barley, one is spelt, oats, and what did I forget? There's another one, not that essential, because the most common one that we need to know about is actually wheat. Combined with water and allowed to sit without baking more than 18 minutes. It doesn't need to have yeast. It's combining water with one of these kinds of grains. That is chametz. That is not allowed. So right away, it's basically, yeah, you got it. We don't eat bread. We don't eat cakes. We don't eat rolls. We don't eat pretzels. We don't drink beer. And that is done the 8 days of Pesach. So if you want to keep Pesach properly, and I urge you to try to do so, I mean, this is one of the easier things, Just don't eat bread for a week. You have the low carbs diets. You don't have to eat matzah, by the way. You can eat, the obligation to eat matzah, as I will say in a moment, is the first night, or the diaspora, the first 2 nights. And so you will have such a huge mitzvah and a huge merit to avoid the consumption of chametz during these 8 days. It's just, and it's honored by Jews all over the world, of all stripes, so to speak. It's somewhat less known on some level in Slovakia, although if you read different stories, of course, people in Slovakia, even during totalitarianism, were careful not to eat chametz. Many, many Jews in Galanta, for example, they would take matzah to school. Their friends would know, oh, they're Jewish, they don't eat bread this week. I must say my own family was not very observant when I was a child, as most of you know, and we belonged to a Reformed temple. We didn't eat any bread or any cakes for 8 days. It was my mother would not hear of anything different than that. And that was that. And so that should not be looked at something as being extreme. Some people say, oh, I can't live without bread for a week. I'm not a doctor. That's probably not true. I don't know if, bread is not one of those things. I mean, there could be exceptional situations. I don't want to have that on my, that's one thing. That's a negative commandment. Now, there's a positive commandment to eat matzahs. It's an ironic commandment. Why? Because what we do, we take one of the grains that's not allowed to have chametz, and we mix it with the water. But what do we make? We cook it. We bake it very quickly. Matzahs are baked at extremely high temperatures for 3 to 4 minutes at the most. They're mixed and thrown in there. Hand matzahs for sure, wood ovens. They go from zero, for being room temperature to being baked in 2 to 3 minutes. Machine matzahs are slightly different because they're on a conveyor belt, and so they start to bake a little bit before they get into the oven, which is another question, but nonetheless, they are baked extremely quickly. But it's very nerve-wracking to make matzahs because you're timing everything, make sure it's very, very fast. Everything has to get clean because if there's remnants of the flour that are not cleaned off and those stay for 8 minutes, everything becomes chametz. Chametz is a prohibition which does not become nullified in a larger quantity. So even the smallest amount renders the whole admixture as being prohibited. And yet matzahs we make from water and flour. And that's a positive commandment. You shall eat matzahs. It's a positive commandment saying that this is how we should celebrate the day. There's a historical side to it that the Jews didn't have time to bake the bread. They put it on their backs and they ran out of Egypt and it baked in the sun very quickly. So it has a reminiscent aspect to it as well. The commandment to eat matzahs applies the first night of Pesach, according to the Torah, from the biblical perspective. And in the diaspora, the first 2 nights. It must be nighttime for a very simple reason. Until it is nighttime, it is not yet Pesach. So if you eat your matzahs next week at 6, you didn't eat matzahs on Pesach. Pesach begins the next day. The next day is when it gets dark out, and completely dark out. Otherwise, it's a question. Is it next day or is it only twilight? So guys, don't eat your matzahs to next week until it's 8:20. Regarding the seeming paradox about why the greatest mitzvah of eating on the holiday of Pesach brings us into a risk of transgressing the most serious prohibition. And the Katan Sofer asks this question. If chametz is so bad, and indeed it is, it represents the worst trait, pride, arrogance, becoming big. So the commandment of eating matzah should have been with one of the substances that doesn't become chametz, like corn, for example. And yet, we're not using water. And yet we take the very components that have the potential for chametz, and from this we make matzah. And this teaches us that we cannot solve the difficulties of coping with the material world and permeating it with spirituality by avoiding the components that create materiality. We must throw ourselves into the world, but we must do so guided by the Torah, and in this way elevate the world. So you have all the 8 days, the prohibition of eating chametz. It begins actually midday, even slightly before. So on April 19th, from 11:21 in the morning, you already may not eat chametz until 9 p.m. Saturday night, April 27th. Then at nighttime, after 8:21 p.m. Friday night, begins the commandment of eating matzahs. That is repeated in the diaspora the second night. But the first night we have other commandments as well. We have the commandment to tell the story of the going out of Egypt. We have a rabbinic commandment to drink 4 glasses of wine, which symbolize and represent 4 expressions for redemption that are used in the Torah. We have a commandment to eat bitter herbs. Chrein is the most popular. Or you can have a bitter kind of a salad, such as romaine lettuce. Radishes should not be used for maror. So we have to talk, we have to eat, we have to drink something, and the eating symbolism goes in both directions. We have symbols such as drinking wine representing emancipation. We have symbolic foods such as maror, the bitter herbs representing the remembrance of slavery. And then there's both of these things that we need to remember. Why? Now we're emancipated, indeed, but the experience of the Seder is supposed to be relived, and therefore only talking about the emancipation and freedom we've had relatively since the exodus from Egypt, because indeed, with all the persecutions and suffering, it is interesting to note we've never been slaves since then. Nonetheless, to relive the exodus, we also have to relive the slavery in order to appreciate and relive the process of freedom. And that is why we also have to have maror, and also bitter herbs, and also, for example, wine, which represents the freedom, the cherut, as it's called in Hebrew. And indeed, this is one of the interesting points about the 4 questions. What is different? What makes this night different from all other nights? In the sense that all other nights we eat matzah and chametz. Now only matzah. Other nights we can lean or not lean. Now we only lean. Other nights we eat all kinds of vegetables. Now only bitter herbs. And one great rabbi, Reb Chaim Brisk, of Soloveitchik, asked the question, or explains, that this is the confusion of the boy. We lean, so we're celebrating freedom. But we eat maror, so we're reliving slavery. Which is it? And the answer is both. Now this is going to bring us to the point I would like to raise, which really brings us to the essence of the Seder, and I will try to describe it briefly in the very next clip.